On June 21st, 2026, the entire global ocean broke a record it had held for the whole of its measured history, and it beat that record by barely 1/10 of a degree. That sounds like nothing at all. It may be the most alarming nothing on the planet because the sea did not spike and then settle back down. It held that record every single day that followed, while more than 80% of the world's ocean ran a fever at the same time. But the truly unsettling part is not the record itself. It is when it happened. This number was set at the very beginning of an El Niño, the event that has always driven global temperatures to their highest peaks, months before that engine reaches full strength. So if the ocean is already breaking records at the starting line, what on earth happens when the race actually begins? If you want to understand what is really coming, subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this story is going to keep unfolding through the rest of this year, and we will be tracking every step of it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and whether the water near you has felt strangely warm lately. Now, let us get into it. Part 1. The Day. The ocean broke its own record. On June 21st, 2026, the surface of the entire global ocean reached a temperature it had never reached before, on that day in all of recorded history. The number was 20.86 degrees Celsius in one of the two main datasets that watch the sea, and 21 degrees Celsius in the other, and I want you to sit with how strange that sentence actually is. We are not talking about a beach, or a bay, or one overheated corner of one sea. We are talking about the average temperature of every ocean on the planet at once. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, the seas around the poles, all of it, blended into a single planetary reading. And that reading on that day was the highest it has ever been for the time of year since we started keeping track. The scientists who watch the ocean for a living did not describe this the way you might expect. They did not call it a milestone, or a curiosity, or an interesting statistic. The director of the service that recorded it used two words instead: Uncharted territory. That is the phrase now attached to what the sea is doing, and it came from Carlo Bontempo, who runs the Copernicus Climate Change Service, one of the most respected ocean and climate monitoring operations on Earth. When the person whose entire job is to measure the ocean without drama reaches for the phrase uncharted territory, it is worth stopping to ask what he actually saw. Here is the first thing you need to understand, and I'm going to give it to you straight away, because it is the key that unlocks everything else in this video. The record itself is not the terrifying part. The margin was small. The ocean beat its old record by roughly 1/10 of a degree Celsius. If I told you the sea was 1/10 of a degree warmer than it was 2 years ago, you would be forgiven for shrugging. That is less than the difference you would feel dipping your hand in the water. So if the number is that small, why did the people who understand it best reach for the language of the unknown? The answer is not in the size of the record. It is in when the record happened and what it was sitting on top of. And once you see those two things together, the small number stops looking small and starts looking like the first crack in something much larger. Let me start with the when. This record was set at the very beginning of an El Niño. If you have watched this channel for any length of time, you have heard that name. Because a few weeks ago we covered the moment the world's weather agencies announced that the strongest El Niño in a generation might be starting. El Niño is the single biggest natural pulse of heat the climate system produces. It is the event that, historically, pushes global temperatures to their hottest peaks. And the crucial detail, the one almost nobody mentions, is that El Niño does not deliver its full heat on day one. It builds. It typically reaches its peak many months after it begins, usually in the following winter. So a record set now, in June, is a record set before the main event has even arrived. That is the part that changes everything. Because if the ocean is already breaking records at the starting line, the obvious and deeply uncomfortable question is what the numbers look like when the race actually begins. Think of it like standing at the bottom of a staircase you cannot see the top of, and being told you are already higher than anyone has ever climbed. Not at the top, at the bottom. That is what uncharted territory means in this context. Not that today's number is off the chart, that the direction the number is travelling leads somewhere the chart has never been. And it was not a one-day fluke, which is the second thing that separates this from a random hot afternoon in the data. When you hear that a temperature record was broken on a single day, your instinct should be caution, because a single day can be noise, weather wobbles. But this did not wobble back. According to Copernicus, the global ocean stayed at record levels for the time of year every single day after June 21st, right through the end of the month. Day after day, the sea kept posting the highest reading ever measured for that date. By June 30th, the gap between the ocean and its own long-term average had grown to 0.5 degrees Celsius, which was itself the highest that gap had ever been for that day of the year. A single record is an event. 3 weeks of unbroken daily records is a condition. The ocean did not spike, it shifted. Now, 0.5 degree, 1/10 of a degree, these still sound like nothing, and I understand that completely. Our bodies are terrible instruments for feeling what is happening here, because these numbers are averaged across a volume of water so vast that the human mind has no shelf to put it on. So hold on to that discomfort, that sense that the numbers are too small to matter, because in a few minutes I am going to show you exactly how much energy is hiding inside 1/10 of a degree, and it is going to reframe every small number in this story. It is the difference between reading that a fever is 1 degree and understanding that the patient is the entire planet. But before we get to the energy, we need to be honest about the words, because the way this story travelled across the internet was not the way the scientist actually said it. And that gap between what was measured and what went viral is its own part of the story. What did Carlo Buontempo actually mean by uncharted territory, and why does the real version turn out to be more unsettling than the exaggerated one? That is where we go next. Part 2. The words they chose. There is a version of this story that spread across social media in the days after the announcement, and it went something like this. Global ocean temperatures had shattered all previous records, plunging the planet into uncharted territory, and it horrified scientists. If you saw the ocean story at all, that is probably the shape you saw it in. And I want to be careful here, because that framing is not exactly wrong, but it is not exactly right either, and the space between the two is where the real story lives. Start with the word shattered. The ocean did not shatter its record. It beat it by about 1/10 of a degree. Shattering implies a violent leap, a number that left the old record far behind. What actually happened was a narrow, deliberate, relentless overtaking, the kind where the new number edges past the old one and then simply refuses to fall back. So if you were expecting the drama to live in the size of the jump, it does not. And that matters, because when the framing oversells the leap, it hands a gift to everyone who wants to dismiss the whole thing. It lets someone look at the real modest margin and say that is it. That is what all the fuss was about. And just like that, a genuine signal gets waved away because it was described as something it never claimed to be. Now take the word horrified. No named scientist in the actual announcement used that word. What they used was quieter and, honestly, more chilling for being quiet. Carlo Buontempo, the director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service, said that current conditions could indicate the beginning of a new phase, leading once more to uncharted territory. Read that again slowly, because every clause in it is doing work. The beginning of a new phase, not the end of an old one, once more. Meaning we have been to uncharted territory before in the record heat of 2023 and 2024, and we are being pulled back toward it. He is not screaming. He's a scientist calmly telling you the ground is moving, and the calm is the part that should get your attention, because these are not people prone to hyperbole. Their entire professional credibility rests on not exaggerating. He was not alone. Simon van Gennep, the lead oceanographer for the Copernicus Marine Service, added the sentence that I think is the real headline of the whole event. He said that we can expect that 2026 will be among the warmest years ever recorded, and he named the 2 reasons why: El Niño and the continued release of greenhouse gases. He described an ocean, in his words, under sustained thermal stress. Sustained. Not a spike, not a bad week, but a pressure that does not let up. And remember, this is the man whose job is to describe the ocean accurately, not dramatically. When his accurate description and the dramatic internet version happen to point in the same direction, that is worth noticing. So why does the honest version turn out to be scarier than the exaggerated one? Because the exaggerated version is about a single shocking number, and single shocking numbers are easy to file away and forget. The honest version is about a trajectory, and a trajectory does not forget you. When Buontempo says the beginning of a new phase, he's not pointing at June, he's pointing at the months ahead. When Van Gennep says sustained thermal stress, he is describing a condition that persists. The viral post was terrifying in the way a jump scare is terrifying, over in a second. The real statement is terrifying in the way a slow tide coming in is terrifying, because you cannot point to the moment it becomes dangerous, only to the fact that it keeps rising. And that is the thread I want you to hold through this entire video. The scary part was never the record. It was the direction, and the fact that we are near the start of it, not the end. There is also something important buried in that phrase once more. It tells you this is not the ocean's first visit to record territory. We were here in 2023 when the North Atlantic did something so far outside its normal range that oceanographers openly admitted they did not fully understand it. We were here again in 2024, which became the warmest year in the entire instrumental record. And now, in 2026, after a brief pause, the ocean is climbing back toward those marks, and, on individual days, pushing past them. That is what once more means. It means the record heat of a few years ago was not a peak we came down from and left behind. It was a level we are now returning to from below, with an El Niño building underneath us. I want to be fair to the people who shared that viral post, because their instinct was not wrong. They felt that something significant had happened and something significant had. The instinct was right, even if the wording was loose. The ocean really did break a record, it really did stay there, and the people who measure it really are unsettled in their careful, understated way. The correction I am making is not to calm you down. It is to make sure that when I do turn up the volume in a few minutes, you know the volume is earned and not borrowed from a headline. Because here is where we go next. I have told you the global average broke a record and held it, but an average can hide as much as it reveals. An average of the whole ocean could, in theory, be a couple of very hot patches dragging up a lot of ordinary water. So the honest question is, when we look past the single global number and actually spread the map out in front of us, is this a few hotspots doing the heavy lifting, or is it something closer to the entire sea running a fever at the same time? The answer, it turns out, is the one you least want to hear. Part 3. Not one number, but a whole ocean. The global average that broke on June 21st is a single line on a graph, and single lines can lie by omission. So let me pull the map out and show you where that heat actually was, because this is the moment the story stops being about a statistic and starts being about a planet. And the honest answer to whether this was a few hotspots or the whole sea is uncomfortable, because it is closer to the whole sea than anyone would like. By the end of June, roughly 82% of the entire global ocean was experiencing what oceanographers call a marine heat wave. Let me say that number a different way so it lands. More than 4/5 of all the seawater on the surface of this planet was, at the same time, running hotter than its normal range for the season. That is not a hotspot. That is not even a region. That is most of the ocean, everywhere, at once. And the only year in the entire record that beat it was 2024, when the figure was around 83%. So the two largest planet-wide marine heatwave events ever measured have both happened within the last 2 years, and we are living inside the second one right now. A marine heatwave, by the way, is not just water that feels a bit warm. It is a technical threshold. It means the temperature in a given patch of ocean has climbed above the 90th percentile of what that patch normally experiences and stayed there. When a single stretch of coast crosses that line, it can wreck a fishery or bleach a reef. What we're talking about here is that same threshold being crossed across 82% of the global sea surface simultaneously. Hold that against the central thread of this video. The record global average was not one number being dragged up by a few furnaces. It was the sea, almost everywhere, leaning in the same hot direction on the same days, right as El Niño was switching on. And when you zoom into the individual basins, the picture does not soften, it sharpens. Start with the tropical Pacific, because that is the engine room, the stretch of ocean where El Niño is actually born. In June of 2026, the tropical Pacific recorded its warmest June ever measured at 27.26 degrees Celsius. The previous record for that region was 26.9 degrees, set back in 2023. And across the first half of the year, the tropical Pacific matched the mark it set in 2016, 26.91 degrees, which is a number that should make the hair on your neck stand up, and I will tell you why. 2016 was the peak year of one of the most powerful El Niño events in modern history, the one so strong that scientists nicknamed it Godzilla. For the tropical Pacific to already be matching its Godzilla-level heat this early, before the current El Niño has done its real work, is like a runner matching the world record pace in the first 100 meters of a marathon. It tells you the starting conditions are extraordinary. Then there is the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean in June of 2026 did something almost hard to believe. Its basin-wide average reached a record of around 24.3 degrees Celsius, breaking marks that had stood since 2003 and had only just been challenged in 2025. And the marine heatwave coverage there was not 82%, it was 98%, picture that. Practically the entire Mediterranean Sea, the water lapping the coasts of southern Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, every one of those shorelines, effectively the whole basin, above its normal range at the same time, a sea that millions of people swim in, fish in and depend on, running a near-total fever. The North Atlantic told the same story in its own accent. Across the subtropical part of that ocean, sea surface temperatures reached record values, and in some stretches as many as 4 separate months of 2026 each set a new monthly record. 4 months! Along parts of the European Atlantic coastline, the same thing. This is the ocean that drives so much of the weather that crosses into Europe and North America, and large parts of it spent the first half of this year rewriting its own record book, month after month. And it is worth pausing on the numbers for the whole first half of the year, because they carry an important honesty. Across the 6 months from January to June, the global ocean averaged about 20.94 degrees Celsius, which made the first half of 2026 the second warmest opening to any year on record. Second, not first. The record for a first half still belongs to 2024, at roughly 21.04 degrees. I tell you that because the story here is not that every single number is an all-time high. It is more specific and, in a way, more telling than that. June set the monthly record. The daily readings set records for their dates. But the half-year as a whole came in just behind 2024, which means the ocean is not wildly off the scale. It is running neck and neck with the warmest it has ever been, and on individual days and in individual months edging past it. That is a more precise and more credible picture than a wall of superlatives, and it is exactly the picture that should hold your attention, because it is real. The regional readings sharpen it further. In the Mediterranean, the first half of the year came in as the third warmest on record, at about 18.07 degrees Celsius, behind only 2024 and 2025, with the most stubborn heat concentrated in the western half of the basin, and the most persistent global hotspots were not random. Alongside the tropical Pacific, they clustered in the upwelling regions off the coasts of Chile and California, the very places where cold water is supposed to rise and cool the surface, now running warm instead. When the ocean's natural cooling zones start showing record heat, that is its own kind of signal, because those are the regions that are hardest to warm, so put the map back together. The tropical Pacific at a Godzilla level, the Mediterranean nearly saturated and at an all-time high, the subtropical North Atlantic breaking monthly records 4 times over. And stitching them together, an ocean where 82% of the surface qualified as a marine heatwave on the same days the global record fell. This is why the single global number matters. It was not a trick of averaging. It was the honest summary of a sea that was hot almost everywhere you looked, and hot in exactly the places that steer the planet's weather. And notice something about that list of basins. Every one of them is a place that does something to us. The tropical Pacific sets the global thermostat through El Niño. The North Atlantic breeds the hurricanes that cross toward land and feeds the storm tracks that reach Europe. The Mediterranean bakes the air over 3 continents. This is not heat sitting harmlessly in some remote corner of the map. It is heat concentrated in the ocean's control rooms, right as the biggest natural amplifier in the system comes online, which forces the question that the rest of this video has to answer. We keep circling back to El Niño as if it explains everything, and in a sense it does, but only if you understand what it actually is. Because El Niño is not just warm water in the Pacific. It is a machine, a self-reinforcing loop between the ocean and the sky, and it has a way of taking heat that was hidden underwater and throwing it up into the atmosphere where all of us live. So what exactly is this machine? How does it work, and why does its switching on turn a warm ocean into a record-breaking one? To answer that, we have to go down into the Pacific itself. Part 4. The engine. In the Pacific. To understand why a record set in June is so much more frightening than a record set in December, you have to understand the machine that is only now beginning to turn, and it lives in the Pacific, in a band of oceans straddling the equator that acts quite literally as the thermostat for the entire planet. In a normal year, the trade winds blow steadily from east to west across the tropical Pacific. Those winds do something you might not expect. They physically push the warm surface water of the ocean toward the western side, toward Indonesia and the Philippines, piling it up there into what oceanographers call the warm pool, the largest reservoir of warm water anywhere on Earth. And because all that warm water gets shoved west, something has to replace it in the east, off the coast of South America. What rises up to fill the gap is cold water from the deep, a process called upwelling. So in a normal year, the recipe is simple. Winds blow west, warm water stacks up in the west, cold water wells up in the east, and the whole system stays balanced. El Niño is what happens when that balance breaks. For reasons that are still not perfectly understood, the trade winds slacken. Sometimes they stall completely. Sometimes they even reverse. And the moment they weaken, the enormous mass of warm water that had been held in the west against its natural tendency begins to slosh back east across the Pacific like water in a tilted bathtub finding its level again. As that warm water spreads east, it smothers the cold upwelling off South America. The cold water can no longer reach the surface, and so a vast stretch of the tropical Pacific, which would normally be moderated by that upwelling, warms up dramatically instead. Here is the part that makes it a machine rather than just an event. As the eastern Pacific warms, the air above it warms too and begins to rise, which weakens the trade winds even further, which lets even more warm water slosh east, which warms the ocean even more. Each step feeds the next. Scientists have a name for this loop. They call it the Bjerknes feedback, after the researcher who first described it, and it is the reason El Niño, once it starts, tends to build on itself and grow stronger before it finally exhausts and reverses. This is why El Niño does not arrive all at once. It winds up. It gathers strength over months, which is exactly why a record at the beginning is so much more ominous than a record at the peak. The feedback loop that drives it has barely begun to turn. Now that is the part most people know, that El Niño means a warm Pacific. But there is a second half to the machine that matters far more for the story we're telling, and it is the half that connects the ocean directly to you. Because El Niño does not just rearrange heat within the ocean, it takes heat that was stored in the water and releases it into the atmosphere. During a normal year, and especially during El Niño's cold sibling La Niña, the ocean is busy pulling heat down into itself, hiding it below the surface. During El Niño, that process runs in reverse. The warm water spread across the surface of the Pacific gives up its heat to the air above it, and because the atmosphere is connected everywhere, that heat then radiates out across the whole globe. This is the mechanism, the actual physical reason, that El Niño years are consistently the hottest years on the global record. The ocean is cashing in heat it had been saving. So look at what the data already showed us. The tropical Pacific, the exact stretch of ocean where this machine lives, posted its hottest June ever at 27.26 degrees Celsius. That is not a coincidence sitting next to the global record. That is the cause standing right next to the effect. The engine is warming exactly where we would expect an El Niño engine to warm, and the global ocean is setting records exactly as we would expect when that engine fires up on top of already warm seas. The tropical Pacific reading and the global record are the same story told at two different scales. The world's weather agencies saw this coming and said so out loud. The World Meteorological Organization declared that El Niño conditions were underway on June 2nd of 2026. The United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration followed with its own El Niño declaration on June 11th. Those declarations are not casual. They are issued only when the ocean and atmosphere have both crossed specific thresholds and are locked into the pattern. So by the time the global temperature record fell on June 21st, the machine had already been officially switched on for less than 3 weeks. 3 weeks into an event that takes many months to peak. That is the timeline you cannot unsee once you have seen it, and the forecasters are not expecting a gentle one. The outlook points toward a likely strong El Niño, which raises the odds that we will keep watching records fall through the rest of the year, in the ocean and in the air alike. Simon van Gennep said it plainly that 2026 will likely land among the warmest years ever recorded. He is not guessing. He is reading the machine. But here is what still does not add up, and it is the gap I promised to close. El Niño is a natural cycle. It has been happening for thousands of years, long before smokestacks and highways, long before any of us. Powerful El Niño events came and went across all of human history, so if El Niño is natural and ancient, why is this one breaking records that its ancestors never touched? Why now? The Pacific engine explains the spark. It does not explain why the whole system is sitting on so much more fuel than it used to. And that fuel, the thing that turns an ordinary El Niño into a record-breaking one, is the part of the story almost nobody wants to look at directly. Part 5. Why this time it breaks the record. El Niño has been visiting this planet for as long as the Pacific has existed. Ancient civilizations that never had a word for it still lived and died by its rhythms, by the years the fish vanished off Peru or the rains failed over Asia. Powerful El Niño events tore through the 1800s and the 1900s. So the question that has to be answered, if this video is going to be honest with you, is why this El Niño is breaking records that all of those older and sometimes stronger events never came close to. And the answer is the single most important idea in the entire story of the modern ocean. It is not that El Niño got bigger, it is that the water it is warming was already hotter than it has ever been before an El Niño started. Think of it as the difference between a wave and the tide. El Niño is a wave. It rises, it peaks, it falls back, and it does this on its own natural rhythm, entirely separate from anything humans do. But that wave does not rise from sea level. It rises from whatever the waterline already is. And over the last century and a half, the baseline waterline, the level the wave starts from, has been climbing steadily upward. So when today's El Niño wave rises, it does not have to be any taller than the El Niño waves of the past. It simply starts from higher ground. And that is enough to carry it over records the older waves could never reach. A wave the same size as one from 100 years ago now breaks over a wall that used to be safely out of reach, because the whole ocean it is riding on has come up. What raised that baseline is not mysterious, and I'm not going to dress it up. It is the heat trapped by more than a century of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But here is the part that connects it directly to the ocean, the part that makes this a sea story and not just a sky story. The atmosphere is not where most of that trapped heat has gone. The oceans have absorbed roughly 90% of all the excess heat that human activity has added to the planet. 90%. The air we live in, the heat waves we complain about, all of that is happening in the 10% that stayed above the water. The other 90% went into the sea. The ocean has been, in effect, the planet's great shock absorber. Every summer that felt survivable, every winter that was not quite as brutal as it might have been, we owe in large part to the fact that the sea quietly swallowed the vast majority of the heat and spared the atmosphere the full dose. Water can do this because it has an enormous capacity to absorb heat without its temperature shooting up. You can pour a staggering amount of energy into the ocean and move its temperature only a fraction of a degree. That property is exactly why the numbers in this story sound so small, and exactly why those small numbers are so alarming. When you see the ocean's surface tick up by 1/10 of a degree, you are not looking at a small amount of heat. You are looking at the visible edge of an almost unimaginable amount of heat, because it takes an almost unimaginable amount to move that number at all. And this is the thread that ties the whole video together. The record on June 21st was not caused by El Niño alone, and it was not caused by the warming baseline alone. It was caused by the two of them stacking. The baseline lifted the starting line to record height, and then El Niño, right on cue, began adding its natural pulse of heat on top. Neither one by itself would have done it. The El Niño is not unusually strong yet. The baseline warming, on any single day, is gradual and quiet. But put the wave on top of the risen tide, and the water goes over a wall it has never gone over before at this time of year. That is the machinery behind the phrase uncharted territory. Two ordinary things, combining into something the record book has never seen. You can actually watch this stacking in the shape of the data. In years dominated by La Niña, El Niño's cold sibling, the ocean pulls heat downward, and the global surface temperature dips slightly, even as the underlying baseline keeps rising. Then El Niño arrives, the stored heat vents upward, and the surface leaps to a new record. Down a step, up 2 steps, down a step, up 2 steps. But every one of those dips lands higher than the last because the staircase itself is tilted upward the whole time. The El Niño gives you the dramatic jumps. The baseline makes sure that each jump clears the one before it. And right now we are at the bottom of one of those upward leaps. with the staircase already tilted higher than it has ever been. So when someone tells you this is just a natural cycle, they are holding a real piece of the truth. El Niño genuinely is natural. But they are holding only half of it. The natural cycle is real, and it is riding on an ocean that a century of our own heat has lifted to record levels first. The wave is nature. The height of the water it starts from is us. And you cannot understand the record on June 21st by looking at only one of them, any more than you could understand a flood by studying only the wave and ignoring the tide. But I have been talking about the baseline as if 1/10 of a degree at the surface is where the story lives, and it is not. The surface is only the skin. If you really want to measure how much heat the ocean has taken on, the surface temperature is almost a distraction. There is a deeper number, one that does not wobble with the weather, one that has been climbing with a consistency that frankly ought to frighten you more than any single day's record. It is called ocean heat content, and once you understand what it has been doing, the small surface numbers will never look small again. Part 6. The number. Beneath the number. If the surface temperature of the ocean is the fever you can feel with the back of your hand, ocean heat content is the reading on the thermometer that has been sitting under the tongue for decades. It is the more honest number, and it is the more frightening one, precisely because it refuses to be dramatic. It does not spike and fall. It just climbs. Here is what ocean heat content actually measures. Instead of looking only at the thin skin of water at the very top, which is whipped around by winds and storms and the day-to-day chaos of weather, ocean heat content measures the total amount of heat stored in the upper layers of the ocean as a whole, going down hundreds of meters. That makes it far more stable than surface temperature, because you cannot fake it with a hot week or a passing calm. A marine heat wave can flare and fade at the surface in weeks. The heat stored deep in the water column reflects the long, slow accumulation of energy over years. It is the ocean's memory, and it does not forget. And that memory set a new record in 2025. The upper ocean absorbed more heat than in any year since modern measurements began, taking in an additional amount of energy estimated at around 23 zetajoules in a single year. Now zetajoule is not a word that means anything to most of us, so let me translate it. A zetajoule is a 1 followed by 21 zeros, in joules, the basic unit of energy. 23 of them, added to the ocean in 1 year, is an amount of energy comparable to running the entire planet's energy consumption, every power plant, every car, every furnace for decades. All of that, poured into the sea in 12 months. And that was not the total heat in the ocean. That was just the extra, the amount added in a single year on top of everything already there. But the record itself is not even the most unsettling part. This is. 2025 was the 9th year in a row that ocean heat content set a new record. 9 consecutive years, each one hotter than the last, the longest unbroken streak of record ocean heat ever documented. Sit with that because it cuts straight to the heart of everything we have been discussing. The surface temperature bounces around with El Niño and La Niña, up and down, jump and dip. But underneath all that noise, the total heat in the ocean has gone in exactly one direction, every single year for nearly a decade. No pause, no reversal, just up and up and up. That relentless, boring, one-directional climb is the real signal, and it is the baseline I described in the last part made visible as a hard number. Now go back to that 1/10 of a degree that opened this whole story, the margin by which the surface record was broken, the number that seemed too small to matter. Ocean heat content is what tells you how much energy is hiding behind it. Because water resists changing temperature so stubbornly, moving the average surface of the entire global ocean up by even a fraction of a degree requires pouring in a quantity of heat that beggars belief. The 1/10 of a degree is not the heat, it is the receipt. It is the small, tidy number printed at the bottom after an enormous invisible transaction has already taken place beneath the surface. When you see the surface tick up, the real event happened below, in the part of the ocean you never see, and the number that never makes the headlines. This is why the scientists do not panic at the size of the surface record and do not need to. They are not reading the 1/10 of a degree as a 1/10 of a degree. They are reading it as the visible tip of that 23 zetajoule iceberg, the surface expression of 9 straight years of accumulating heat. To them, the modest margin is not reassuring at all because they know what it takes to produce it. And it is why the phrase uncharted territory is not about June the 21st specifically. It is about the trajectory that the deeper number has been tracing steadily, without pause, into a range the planet has not experienced in the entire span of human civilization. And a warmer ocean does not just sit there being warm. Heat is energy, and energy in the ocean gets spent. Water that is warmer takes up more space, which is one of the two great drivers of rising seas, entirely separate from any melting ice. A warmer surface evaporates faster, loading the atmosphere with more moisture, which becomes the ammunition for heavier rainfall and more violent storms. The heat we are measuring is not an accounting curiosity. It is potential energy, stored across 71% of the planet's surface, waiting to be converted into weather, and El Niño is the mechanism that has just begun converting it. So now we have both halves of the machine in front of us. We have El Niño, the natural engine that vents ocean heat into the sky and builds toward its peak over many months. And we have the baseline, the 9-year climb in stored heat that has lifted the whole ocean to a level it has never held before. Put them side by side and one question becomes impossible to avoid, the question this entire video has been walking toward. If the record fell in June, at the very start, with the engine barely warmed up, then where does the line go when the engine reaches full power? That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the specific thing the scientists are watching for, and the reason they chose the words they chose. Part 7. The record came at the start, not the peak. Everything in this video has been building to a single, simple, deeply uncomfortable observation, and now that you have the machine and the baseline in front of you, I can finally lay it out in full. The record ocean temperature of June 2026 did not arrive at the peak of anything. It arrived at the beginning. And in the strange arithmetic of the climate system, that one fact turns a modest record into the most alarming part of the whole story. Let me walk you through why timing matters this much, because it is not obvious. When an El Niño begins, the ocean and atmosphere have only just started their feedback loop. The warm water is beginning to spread east. The trade winds are beginning to slacken, but the heat has not yet finished venting from the sea into the sky. That process, the great transfer of stored ocean heat into the global atmosphere, takes months to complete, which is why the historical pattern is so consistent and so important. The hottest year on the global record is almost never the year an El Niño begins. It is the year after. The El Niño lights the fuse in one year, and the explosion of global temperature comes in the next, as all that vented heat works its way through the atmosphere. The heat you feel is always running a step behind the ocean that released it. So hold that pattern against what we are actually looking at. El Niño conditions were declared in early June. The global ocean record fell on June 21st, barely 3 weeks later. That record was set during the ignition, not the burn. If the ocean is already at a record for the time of year at the moment of ignition, then by the logic of every El Niño that has come before, the real heat, the peak, the year after effect is still ahead of us. Which means June was not the climax of this event. In all likelihood, June was the floor. I want to make sure that word lands because it inverts the way most people instinctively read a record. When you hear that something hit a record high, you picture a summit, a peak, the highest point before things come back down. But a record set at the start of an El Niño is the opposite of a summit. It is a starting line that happens to be higher than any finish line we have seen before. The scientists are not looking at June and thinking, well, that was the worst of it. They are looking at June and thinking, if this is where we begin, where do we end? That gap between a record that feels like a ceiling and a record that is actually a floor is the entire reason for the unease in their voices. This is exactly what Carlo Bontempo meant when he said current conditions could indicate the beginning of a new phase. The beginning. Not the peak, not the exception, but the opening of something with more still to come. And it is what Simon van Gennep meant when he predicted that 2026 would rank among the warmest years ever recorded, because he is reading the same pattern. The ocean released its first signal in June, and the atmosphere, running its usual step behind, has the rest of the year and beyond to catch up. The forecast for a likely strong El Niño only sharpens the point. A strong event vents more heat than a weak one, and it has not even reached its expected peak, which typically falls in the following winter, many months from that June record. There is a detail from the data that drives this home better than any argument. Remember that in the first half of 2026, the tropical Pacific already matched the mark it set in 2016. the peak year of the Godzilla El Niño. Think about what that comparison actually means in light of the timing. In 2016, that number represented the culmination, the top of one of the strongest El Niño events ever recorded, the very peak of the burn. In 2026, the same number appeared at the start during ignition. The same height reached at two completely different points in the cycle. Reaching a peak level number at the starting line is the single clearest sign of how much higher the starting line now sits and how much room there may be above it. And this is where the small margin from the very beginning of the video finally reveals what it was hiding. 1/10 of a degree set at the floor of an El Niño on top of 9 straight years of record ocean heat is not a small story about a small number. It is a large story wearing a small number as a disguise. The 10th of a degree was never meant to shock you on its own. It was meant to be read in context, and the context is that it is the lowest step of a staircase that is still being climbed, in a stairwell taller than any we have measured. The people who understand the ocean best are not frightened by how high June was. They're frightened by how low it might turn out to have been. So what does it actually look like when the engine reaches full power? What does a record ocean, still climbing toward its peak, do to the world that lives on its shores? This is not an abstract question, and the ocean does not keep its heat to itself. That stored energy gets spent, and some of the ways it gets spent are things that will arrive on coastlines, in weather forecasts and on reefs, long before the final numbers for 2026 are ever tallied. The first place that heat goes to work is in the storms. Part 8. The fuel that feeds. The storms. A hurricane is, at its core, a heat engine that runs on warm ocean water, and that single fact is why a record warm sea is not just a line on a graph, but a loaded gun pointed at every coastline in the tropics. To understand why the ocean record of June should worry anyone living near the water, you have to understand that everything we have been measuring, the stored heat, the marine heat waves, the warm pools, is precisely the fuel that the coming storm season will burn. Here is the mechanism, kept simple. A tropical storm forms over warm water and draws its energy upward from the sea surface. Warm water evaporates readily, and as that moist air rises into the storm and the water vapor condenses into cloud and rain, it releases heat, which drives the winds faster, which pulls up more warm moist air, which releases more heat. It is a feedback loop of its own, a cousin of the one that drives El Niño, and the warmer the water underneath it, the more powerful the engine can grow. Cold water starves a hurricane, warm water feeds it, and a record warm ocean, with heat stored not just at the surface but deep into the water column, feeds it in a particular and dangerous way. That depth matters more than most people realize, and it connects straight back to the ocean heat content we talked about. When a storm churns across the sea, its winds stir the water and drag colder water up from below, which would normally cool the surface and choke off the storm's own fuel supply. But when the ocean is warm, not just at the skin but far down into the depths, that stirring no longer brings up cold water, it brings up more warm water. The storm's own brakes stop working. This is the condition that leads to what forecasters fear most, rapid intensification, when a storm explodes from a manageable system into a monster in a matter of hours, sometimes too fast for the people in its path to react. Research has found that rapid intensification, especially in places like the Gulf of Mexico, becomes markedly more likely during marine heat waves, the very conditions blanketing more than 80% of the global ocean right now. And studies of past storms have found that a large majority of hurricanes in recent decades formed over water that was under marine heatwave conditions. The warm anomaly is not a footnote to these storms, it is increasingly their birthplace. It helps to put concrete numbers on why depth matters so much. A tropical cyclone generally needs a sea surface of at least about 26 degrees Celsius, roughly 79 degrees Fahrenheit, to form and sustain itself, and forecasters watch not just that surface number, but how deep that warm layer goes, a measurement sometimes called ocean heat potential. A thin skin of warm water over a cold layer is a weak fuel tank, because the storm's own churning quickly reaches the cold water and stalls the engine. A deep column of warm water is a full tank that the storm cannot easily drain. The record heat we have been measuring is not only warming the skin, it is deepening that warm layer, filling the tank further down than usual, and that is precisely the setup that produces rapid intensification, which forecasters define as a storm's winds increasing by at least about 35 miles per hour in a single 24-hour period. When you hear that a storm jumped overnight from a modest system to something approaching the Category 5 threshold of about 157 mile per hour winds, you're almost always hearing about a storm that passed over exactly this kind of deep, record warm water. The ocean record and the overnight monster are the same fuel tank, read two different ways. Now layer the El Niño back on top, because El Niño complicates the storm picture in a way that is worth being precise about, since it does not point in only one direction. In the Atlantic, El Niño tends to increase the wind shear that can tear storms apart, which historically suppresses the number of Atlantic hurricanes. So you might think a strong El Niño would mean a quiet season. But that is where the record ocean heat changes the calculation. A hostile El Niño atmosphere sitting over a record warm ocean is a tug of war, and the fear among forecasters is that the water is now so warm that the storms which do manage to form have more explosive fuel available than ever before. The risk shifts from how many to how strong. Fewer storms, perhaps, but each one with the potential to intensify faster and hit harder, because the sea beneath it is carrying record heat. In the Pacific, meanwhile, El Niño tends to do the opposite and energize tropical activity, which is its own concern for the basins on that side of the world. We have watched this exact dynamic on this channel before. In the storms we have covered over the past weeks, the typhoons that intensified with frightening speed over a superheated Western Pacific. Those were not anomalies detached from everything else. They were the ocean record expressing itself in real time, the stored heat converting into wind and rain and forward speed. Every one of those systems was, in a sense, a withdrawal from the same overheated account we have been describing. The record on June 21st and a typhoon that doubles in strength overnight are not two stories. They are the same heat, measured in one place and unleashed in another, and this is the through line I want you to keep hold of. The ocean record is not a passive fact that sits quietly in a database. It is potential energy, and potential energy gets converted. The same stored heat that pushed the surface to a record in June is the fuel that the hurricane and typhoon seasons of 2026 will draw from as they reach their own peaks later in the year, at roughly the same time the El Niño reaches its. The timing lines up in the worst possible way. The ocean will likely be near its hottest, exactly when the storm season is near its most active. A record set at the floor in June becomes months later the fuel supply for whatever the peak has in store. But storms are the loud consequence, the one that makes the news. There is a quieter one unfolding underwater, out of sight, and it may be the truest measure of what a record warm ocean actually does to the living world. It is happening on the reefs, and the reefs have been trying to warn us. Part 9. The reefs are sounding the alarm. Beneath the surface of that record warm ocean, in the shallow tropical waters where the sea meets the light, something has been dying on a scale that is hard to fully absorb, and it is the closest thing the ocean has to a warning siren we can actually see. Coral reefs are the part of the sea that cannot run from the heat, and because they cannot run, they have become the record warm ocean's most honest witnesses. To understand what the heat does to them, you have to understand what a coral actually is. A coral is an animal that lives in partnership with a tiny algae inside its own tissue. The algae uses sunlight to make food and shares it with the coral, and in return the coral gives the algae a home. That partnership is what builds reefs, and it is what gives coral its colour. But the relationship is fragile, and it is exquisitely sensitive to temperature. When the water gets too warm for too long, the partnership breaks down. The coral expels the algae living inside it, and without the algae, the coral loses both its colour and its main source of food. It turns bone white. This is coral bleaching, and a bleached coral is not yet dead, but it is starving, and if the heat does not relent, it dies. What has unfolded across the world's reefs over the past 2 years is the largest such event ever recorded. It was confirmed as the 4th global coral bleaching event, and the numbers attached to it are staggering in the most literal sense. Bleaching level heat stress struck roughly 84% of the world's coral reef area, across all 3 of the ocean basins that hold reefs, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian. Mass bleaching was documented in more than 80 countries and territories. In some places, the mortality was almost total. Along stretches of the Pacific coast, coral death reached as high as 90% or more. These are not projections or models. This is what surveyors found when they went into the water and looked. What tips a coral from stressed into dying is not just how hot the water gets, but how long it stays hot. And scientists measure that combination directly, tracking both the temperature above the danger threshold and the number of weeks it persists. It is the accumulation that kills. A brief spike a reef can survive, a moderate excess that lingers for months it often cannot. During this event, individual marine heat waves parked over reef regions for stretches measured in months, in one documented case running around 80 days with the water sitting more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above the normal for that place and season. That is the lethal recipe. Not a single hot afternoon, but a season-long fever that never breaks, and it maps exactly onto what we have been describing about the wider ocean. A warmth that is sustained rather than sudden. The reefs are dying not because the water got briefly very hot, but because it got persistently too warm, which is the same word the oceanographers keep using about the global sea. Sustained. And here is why this belongs at the centre of the ocean heat story, and not off to the side as an environmental sidebar. The reefs are a threshold made visible. All the way through this video I have been asking you to trust that small surface numbers represent enormous amounts of heat, that 1/10 of a degree is the tip of something vast. The reefs are where that abstraction becomes flesh. Coral does not care about the global average or the anomaly for the date. It responds to the actual heat in the actual water around it, and its response is unambiguous. When the ocean crosses a line, the coral bleaches. So when you see bleaching strike 84% of the world's reef area, you're watching the ocean cross that line nearly everywhere reefs exist. At the same time, it is the biological confirmation of the same planet-wide warmth the satellites measured from above. The reefs are also where the human stakes stop being abstract. It is tempting to think of coral as scenery, something beautiful that exists for documentaries and diving holidays, and losing it as a purely aesthetic tragedy. But roughly 500 million people around the world depend on coral reefs, for the fish that feed them, for the income that reef fisheries and reef tourism provide, and for the physical protection that reefs give to coastlines by breaking the force of waves and storms before they reach the shore. When a reef dies, the fish that lived in it thin out, the food supply for coastal communities shrinks, and the natural seawall that protected the coast begins to crumble, at exactly the moment when a record-warm ocean is loading the storms that will test that coastline. The loss of the reef and the strengthening of the storm are the same heat, working both ends against the people caught in the middle. So the reef is a canary, and the canary has stopped singing across most of the world's reefs at once. That is what makes it so important to witness. It cannot be accused of exaggeration. It cannot oversell the record the way a viral post did. It simply lives or dies according to the temperature of the water, and right now, across 84% of its range, it has been dying. If you wanted a single piece of evidence that the ocean's warmth is not a statistical abstraction, but a physical force with the power to kill on a global scale, you would not need the satellites at all. You would only need to look down at the reef. Of course, not everyone accepts any of this. For every measurement I have described, there is a counter-explanation circulating somewhere, a theory that the record is natural or exaggerated or invented or engineered. And some of those theories deserve a real hearing rather than a dismissal, because a few of them contain a grain of something true, and the honest way through is to take them seriously enough to actually test them. So let us do exactly that. Part 10. What people are saying online. The moment a story like this breaks, a second story forms right behind it, and that second story is the argument over whether the first one is real. So let us walk through the theories that spread alongside the ocean record, and let us do it honestly, because the fastest way to lose a thoughtful person is to wave away a question they are genuinely asking. Some of these ideas are wrong. A few of them contain a real kernel worth respecting, and the way we tell the difference is exactly the same discipline that produced the record itself. We follow the energy. The most common response and the most reasonable sounding is the one we have already touched, the argument that this is simply a natural cycle. It is just El Niño, people say. The climate has always changed. The oceans have always warmed and cooled. Why are we treating an ordinary swing as an emergency? And I want to be clear that this is not a foolish objection. It is half right, and the half that is right is important. El Niño is natural. The climate genuinely has always changed. Warm periods and cold periods have come and gone for as long as there has been an ocean. Anyone who tells you otherwise is not being honest with you. but the objection collapses on the same point we built the whole middle of this video around. The question was never whether the climate can change on its own. The question is why this particular warm swing is clearing records that far larger natural swings never reached. And natural cycles cannot answer that, because a cycle, by definition, returns to where it started. That is what makes it a cycle. El Niño rises and falls and comes back to the same baseline. What we are watching is not a return to the same baseline. It is a baseline that keeps moving up underneath the cycles, the 9 straight years of record ocean heat, that no natural oscillation explains, because no natural oscillation runs in one direction for 9 years without reversing. The cycle is real. The staircase the cycle is climbing is the thing that needs an explanation, and hand-waving about natural change does not provide one. There is a more sophisticated version of the natural argument, and it deserves a real answer too. Maybe some say it is the sun. The sun is the source of nearly all the heat on Earth, so if the planet is warming, is the obvious suspect not the star at the centre of it all? Again, a fair place to look, and again, the answer is in the measurements. We watch the sun constantly, and its output over the period of this relentless ocean warming has been essentially flat, even dipping through the quieter phases of its own cycle, while the ocean kept setting records regardless. A sun that is holding steady, or even dimming slightly, cannot be the engine driving an ocean that is heating without pause. If the sun were the culprit, the warming would track the solar cycle, rising and falling with it. It does not. The ocean climbed through solar highs and solar lows alike, and there is a fingerprint that seals it, one that most people never hear about. If the extra heat were coming from the sun, you would expect the entire atmosphere to warm, top to bottom, because more incoming solar energy heats the whole column. But that is not what the instruments show. The lower atmosphere, where we live, is warming, while the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, is actually cooling. That specific pattern, warming below and cooling above, is not what a brighter sun produces. It is precisely what you get when heat is being trapped near the surface by greenhouse gases, held down instead of escaping to space. This sun would warm the whole room. What we see is a blanket warming the bed and leaving the ceiling cold. That fingerprint points away from the sun and toward the trapped heat that has been pouring into the ocean. So the natural cycle theory, in all its forms, ends in the same place. Yes, the cycle is real. No, it does not explain the record, because the record is the cycle riding on a baseline that natural forces are not moving. Follow the energy, and the energy does not lead back to the sun or to some ordinary swing. It leads to the heat we know is being trapped, 90% of which the ocean has been quietly swallowing for over a century. But there is a more specific version of the natural argument, one that points not at the sun but at the sea floor, at fire beneath the water, and it gained real traction because it attached itself to a genuine scientific mystery. That one is worth its own hard look. Part 11. The fire beneath the water. One theory that's spread widely is more concrete than a vague appeal to natural cycles, and because it points at something real, it deserves a careful answer rather than a dismissal. The idea is that the ocean is being heated from below by underwater volcanoes, and in particular by a single enormous eruption that really did happen and really did affect the climate. This is the kind of theory that is dangerous precisely because it is not made of nothing. It has a true seed. The honest thing to do is find the seed, admit it, and then measure whether it can carry the weight the theory puts on it. Start with the general claim that undersea volcanoes are cooking the ocean. There are indeed countless volcanic vents along the ocean floor, and they do release heat into the water. That part is true. But when you actually measure how much heat, the theory falls apart immediately, because the total heat released by all the planet's undersea volcanism is trivially small compared to the heat the ocean absorbs from the trapped solar energy above it. We are talking about a difference of many orders of magnitude. The geothermal heat seeping up from the seafloor is real, but it is a candle next to the bonfire of absorbed surface heat. And crucially, that geothermal heat has been roughly constant for a very long time. It cannot explain a sudden 9-year climb, because it did not suddenly switch on 9 years ago. A constant source cannot produce a rising trend. The energy budget simply does not close. Then there is the specific case, the one with the real kernel, and I want to give it its full due, because this is where honesty matters most. In early 2022, an undersea volcano in the Pacific called Hungatonga erupted with tremendous violence. And it did something unusual. Because it erupted underwater, it blasted an enormous quantity of water vapour high into the stratosphere, more than any eruption we have measured in the satellite era. And water vapour is itself a greenhouse gas, so scientists genuinely studied whether that injection of stratospheric water vapour could have nudged global temperatures upward. This is not a conspiracy. This is a real question that real climate scientists asked, in the open, in the journals. That is the kernel of truth the theory is built around. But here is where following the evidence separates the kernel from the exaggeration. When scientists measured the effect of Hungatonga, they found it was small and temporary, and not remotely large enough to account for the sustained record warmth of the ocean. Some analyses even found the eruption's net effect could have leaned slightly toward cooling, because it also lofted reflective particles alongside the water vapour. Either way, the signal was minor and fading, while the ocean's record heat was major and persisting. A one-time eruption produces a one-time bump that decays. What we are watching does not decay. It is sustained, and it is still climbing years after the eruption's influence would have washed out. The volcano is real, its effect was real, and its effect is far too small and far too brief to be the explanation. The seed was true. The tree it was supposed to grow into does not exist. I said this theory attached itself to a genuine mystery, and it did. So let me tell you about the real puzzle, because it is more interesting than the volcano, and more honest than pretending scientists have every answer. In 2023, the North Atlantic warmed so suddenly and so far beyond its normal range that oceanographers were, in their own words, genuinely puzzled. It was one of the events that pulled the phrase Uncharted territory into use in the first place, and the leading explanations were not volcanic at all. One of the strongest candidates was almost the opposite of what people expect. New international rules had sharply cut the sulfur pollution from ships, and that pollution, dirty as it was, had been reflecting some sunlight back to space and slightly shading the ocean beneath the busiest shipping lanes. Clean up the pollution, remove the shade, and more sunlight reaches the water. It is possible that by cleaning the air we inadvertently let a little more heat into the sea. Scientists are still debating how large that effect is. Notice what that real mystery tells you, though, because it is the opposite of comforting. The genuine uncertainty among scientists is not about whether the ocean is warming or whether trapped heat is the cause. Those are settled by the energy budget and the fingerprints. The uncertainty is about the details of why a specific patch warmed a specific amount in a specific year. That is normal science, arguing over the mechanism at the edges while the main picture holds firm. The volcano theory tries to smuggle a settled question. Is the ocean really warming from trapped heat, inside an unsettled one? Exactly how did the North Atlantic spike in 2023? And once you separate the two, the theory has nowhere to stand. The ocean is warming, the trapped heat is the cause, and the fire beneath the water is a candle being asked to explain a furnace. But if the volcano cannot explain it, there is always the most direct accusation of all, the one that skips mechanisms entirely and simply says the numbers are fake. Maybe the ocean is not really breaking records at all. Maybe the record is an artifact of who is doing the measuring, and how, and why. That accusation deserves an answer too, and the answer happens to be one of the most quietly astonishing achievements in all of science. Part 12. Are they faking the numbers? If you cannot argue with what the ocean is doing, the last move available is to argue that we do not really know what the ocean is doing, that the records are manufactured, the data massaged, the whole thing an artifact of institutions with an agenda. It is worth taking this seriously, not because the evidence supports it, but because answering it reveals something most people have never appreciated, which is just how many independent eyes are actually watching the sea, and how hard it would be for any of them to lie. Let me tell you how we actually know the temperature of the ocean, because the moment you understand the system, the idea of faking it becomes almost physically impossible. It does not rest on one instrument, or one agency, or one country. It rests on several completely different measurement systems built by different people using different physics that all have to agree. The first is a fleet of robots you have probably never heard of, called Argo floats. There are thousands of them, drifting throughout the world's oceans, and they are one of the unsung marvels of modern science. Each float is an autonomous instrument that sinks down through the water column, sometimes to a depth of 2 kilometers, measuring temperature and salinity the whole way, then rises back to the surface and beams its readings up to a satellite before sinking again to repeat the cycle. They do this over and over, for years, all across the globe, with no human aboard. They are how we actually measure the deep ocean heat content we discussed earlier, directly, physically, by putting a thermometer in the water hundreds of meters down, thousands of times a day, everywhere. This is not a model, it is a direct measurement, taken by a distributed swarm of machines answerable to no single storyline. The second system watches from above. Satellites measure the temperature of the sea surface across the entire globe, constantly, by reading the infrared and microwave energy the ocean radiates. They see the whole surface, including the vast stretches of open ocean no ship ever crosses, and they do it every day. The third system is the old-fashioned one that never went away, the network of moored buoys anchored across the oceans, and the readings taken by ships as they cross. Each of these systems has different strengths and different weaknesses. Satellites see everything but only the skin. Argo floats see the depths, but at scattered points. Buoys sit fixed in place. And the whole picture is assembled by blending them together, a process called reanalysis, which weaves the direct measurements into a coherent map and is itself done by multiple independent groups. Now here is why faking it is not a serious proposition. These systems are run by different organizations in different countries with different methods, and they cross-check each other constantly. The European services and the American agencies and the research institutes in Asia are not a single entity taking orders. They are separate operations, often in quiet competition, publishing their own analyses, and they arrive at the same answer. When Copernicus in Europe reports a record, the independent data sets maintained elsewhere show the same climb. For the record to be fake, every one of these independent systems, the robot floats and the satellites and the buoys and the ships and the separate reanalysis teams on multiple continents, would all have to be falsifying their data in perfect, coordinated agreement, without a single participant breaking ranks, across years. That is not how large groups of competitive, credit-seeking, mutually skeptical scientists behave. The agreement between wholly independent methods is not a weakness to be explained away. It is the strongest possible evidence that the measurement is real, and this connects straight back to the central thread, because it is the same discipline that made the small numbers so alarming in the first place. We did not take the record on faith. We traced it to the ocean heat content, measured directly by the floats. We traced that to the energy budget, which the sun cannot fill and the volcanoes cannot fill. We traced the warming pattern to the fingerprint of trapped heat, the warming below and cooling above. At every step, the answer came from independent instruments that agree. The reason the scientists speak with such quiet confidence is not that they are ideologically committed. It is that they are looking at the same picture from a dozen different angles, and the picture does not change. So the accusation of fakery in the end requires believing something far less plausible than the record itself. It requires a coordinated global deception spanning rival institutions and autonomous machines, all to manufacture a tenth of a degree, when that tenth of a degree is exactly what the physics predicted and exactly what the independent systems each found on their own. The simpler explanation, the one that does not require a conspiracy of thousands and their robots, is that the ocean is warming because we have trapped an enormous amount of heat, and the ocean has absorbed most of it. That is not the fragile story, it is the robust one. There remain two theories at the far edges of this argument, and they sit on opposite extremes. One says the warming is deliberately engineered by secret technology. The other says the situation is so catastrophic that the ocean is essentially about to boil. They could not seem more different, and yet they make the same mistake, and looking at them together is the fastest way to see it. Part 13. The two extremes that make the same mistake. At the two far ends of the argument sit two theories that seem to be opposites, and watching them cancel each other out tells you more about where the truth lies than either one does alone. On one end is the claim that the ocean's warmth is being engineered on purpose, by secret technology, for some hidden reason. On the other is the claim that the warming is a runaway catastrophe, that the ocean is on the verge of boiling, and the planet is about to become unlivable within moments. One says the danger is fake and manufactured. The other says the danger is total and imminent, and both of them make the exact same error, which is that they abandon the measurements the moment the measurements become inconvenient. Take the engineering claim first, usually attached to a facility called HARP, a real research installation in Alaska that studies the upper atmosphere and has become the all-purpose villain of weather conspiracy theories. The idea is that some human technology is deliberately heating the ocean, and the way to test this is the same way we have tested every other theory in this video. Follow the energy. We established that warming the global ocean by even a fraction of a degree requires an amount of heat measured in tens of zettajoules, an energy comparable to running human civilization for decades. There is no facility on Earth, HARP or anything else, that produces energy on anything remotely approaching that scale. A research array that heats a small patch of the ionosphere is not off by a little. It is off by a factor so enormous that the comparison is almost meaningless, like proposing to fill an ocean with an eyedropper. The mechanism does not exist, and the energy budget rules it out before you even get to the question of motive. The very same accounting that makes the ocean record so alarming, the sheer quantity of energy involved, is what makes the idea of engineering it absurd. No one is heating the ocean on purpose, because no one could. Now the opposite extreme, which is in some ways the more seductive because it borrows the language of urgency. The ocean is boiling, this version says. We have passed the point of no return, the seas are about to become lifeless. It is over. And I understand the emotional logic, especially after everything I have just laid out about records and marine heatwaves and dying reefs. But look at what this claim actually requires you to ignore. It requires you to ignore the very numbers that make the real story serious. The record was 1/10 of a degree. The anomaly was 1/2 a degree. These are, as we have discussed at length, enormous in energy terms, but they are not boiling, and pretending they are is not a harmless exaggeration. Boiling is a physical process at 100 degrees Celsius. The ocean is at roughly 21. The gap between reality and the rhetoric is so vast that anyone who checks will feel deceived, and rightly so. And here is why that second extreme is not just wrong but actively harmful, and why I spend time on it at all. When you tell people the ocean is boiling and about to end all life this instant, and then they look outside and the sea is still there, still full of fish, still perfectly swimmable, they do not just discard the exaggeration, they discard the whole story. The overreach becomes the excuse. Every person who dismisses the real, measured, serious signal because someone told them the ocean was boiling and it obviously was not, is a casualty of that exaggeration. The catastrophist and the denier end up on the same side, because the catastrophist hands the denier the ammunition. Nothing makes it easier to wave away a genuine 1/10 of a degree record than someone standing next to it screaming that the water is at a rolling boil. So both extremes make the identical mistake, in opposite directions. The engineer abandons the energy budget to invent a cause that is too small to be real. The catastrophist abandons the energy budget to invent an effect that is too large to be real. And the discipline that defeats both of them is the same one that has carried us through this entire video. Stay with the measurements. Respect what the numbers actually say. The numbers say something that needs neither exaggeration nor denial to be frightening. They say the ocean is at a record. That record was set at the floor of an El Niño. It is sitting on 9 straight years of accumulating heat, and the trajectory leads somewhere we have not been. That is the whole truth, and it is enough. It does not need a secret weapon to explain it or a boiling sea to make it matter. The honest middle, then, is not the boring compromise between two exciting extremes. It is the harder and more demanding position, the one that asks you to hold a serious threat in your mind without inflating it and without dismissing it. The scientists model that stance for us. Bontempo did not say the ocean was boiling, and he did not say it was fine. He said uncharted territory, which is precisely the language of someone staring at a real trajectory into the unknown and refusing to lie about it in either direction. If you want to know how worried to be, do not listen to the two extremes shouting at each other. Listen to the quiet, careful, deeply unsettled people who actually read the instruments. And those people are unsettled in large part because they know history. They know what the ocean has done in the past when it warmed like this, what past El Niños unleashed on the world, because this is not the first time the sea has released its stored heat and reshaped the planet's weather. To understand what may be coming, it helps to look at what has already come before, at the ghosts of El Niño's past. Part 14. The Ghosts of El Niño's Past. The ocean has done versions of this before, and the historical record of past El Niño events is the closest thing we have to a preview of what a record warm sea can do to the world that lives on it. These are not abstract analogies. They are real years with real consequences, and lining them up next to the present reveals both how serious this can get and how much the ground has shifted beneath our feet. Begin with the one that matched our present, the Godzilla El Niño of 2015 and 2016. It was one of the most powerful events ever recorded, and its effects rippled across the entire planet. 2016 became the hottest year on the global record at the time, as all that vented ocean heat worked its way into the atmosphere in the year after the event peaked, exactly the delayed pattern we described. It triggered a global coral bleaching event. It fueled droughts and floods across continents, and I remind you of the specific detail that should chill you in the present context. The tropical Pacific in the first half of 2026 already matched the level it reached in that Godzilla peak. In 2016, that number was the summit of a monster. In 2026, it is the starting point. The same height, one a peak, the other a floor. If Godzilla did what it did from that level as its maximum, the unsettling question is what an event does when it begins its climb from there. It is worth understanding how scientists actually rank these events, because it makes the comparison concrete rather than vague. El Niño's strength is measured by how far the tropical Pacific rises above its normal temperature, tracked through an index that averages the warmth of a key stretch of that ocean over 3-month windows. When that departure crosses 0.5 degrees Celsius, an El Niño is declared. Around 1 degree is considered moderate, around 1.5 degrees strong, and anything above 2 degrees is classed as very strong, the rare top tier. The great event of 1997 and 98 peaked at roughly 2.4 degrees above normal, which is why it remains a benchmark. So when the forecasters say this year's El Niño is likely to be strong, they are pointing toward that upper range, and the whole reason it matters is the delayed pattern we keep returning to. The 1997 event peaked in the winter, and 1998 became the hottest year recorded to that point. The 2015 event peaked in the winter, and 2016 took the record. Each time, the ocean's peak came in 1 year, and the atmosphere's record fell in the next. That is the template now laid over 2026, with its record already set at the floor, and its El Niño still climbing toward the strong tier. Go back further, to the El Niño of 1997 and 98, the benchmark against which strong events are still measured. It was so powerful and so well observed that it entered the public consciousness by name, and it rearranged weather across the globe, bringing catastrophic flooding to some regions and severe drought and wildfire to others, killing thousands and causing damage measured in the tens of billions. It also caused massive coral mortality. What 1997 and 98 demonstrated more clearly than any event before it was that El Niño is not a Pacific curiosity. It is a global force, capable of touching harvests and floods and fires on nearly every continent at once, through the atmospheric connections that carry the Pacific's influence around the world. And then there is the deepest and darkest analogue, the one that reaches back into the 1800s, and reminds us that El Niño's reach has always been measured in human lives, not just in weather maps. The Great El Niño of 1877 and 78 coincided with catastrophic failures of the monsoon rains across Asia and droughts across multiple continents, and the famines that followed killed many millions of people. Historians still argue over the exact toll, but it stands among the deadliest climate-driven catastrophes in recorded human history. I raise it not to predict a repeat, because the world of today is not the world of the 1800s, with its far greater capacity to move food and respond to disaster. I raise it to correct the instinct that treats El Niño as a technical abstraction. When the ocean reorganizes the world's weather, the consequences have historically landed hardest on the people who grow food and depend on the rains. El Niño has always been, at its core, a story about whether it rains where people need it to. There is one more ghost worth summoning, and it is more recent and more regional, but it teaches a specific lesson about persistence. Between roughly 2013 and 2016, a vast patch of unusually warm water settled over the Northeast Pacific and simply refused to leave. Scientists took to calling it with grim simplicity the blob. It was a marine heat wave that locked in place and lasted for years, and while it sat there, it wrecked the ecosystem beneath it. Fisheries collapsed or shifted hundreds of miles, marine life died or fled, toxic algal blooms spread, seabirds and sea lions starved. The blob was a demonstration that a marine heatwave is not always a brief flare that passes. Sometimes the warm water anchors itself and becomes a semi-permanent feature, and everything that lives beneath it pays the price for as long as it stays. Hold that against the fact that more than 80% of the global ocean is currently in a marine heatwave. The blob was one such patch, in one ocean, and it caused years of devastation. What we are watching now is that conditions spread across most of the planet's sea at once. So what do the ghosts collectively tell us? They tell us that El Niño events warm the globe in the year after they peak, that they reshuffle weather across every continent, that they kill reefs and disrupt fisheries, and in the harshest cases threaten the food supply of millions, and they tell us that every one of these past events did its damage from a baseline lower than the one we stand on today. Godzilla peaked at a level we have already reached at the start. The blob was a local patch of the condition that is now nearly global. The historical analogues are not reassuring precedents that show we have seen this before and survived. They are warnings, delivered from a cooler world than ours, about what this machine is capable of, now loaded with more fuel than it has ever carried. And the heat does not stay in the ocean. It comes ashore, and it comes as weather and as water rising against the coast. Part 15. The Slow Flood. You cannot see. There is a consequence of a warming ocean so quiet, so gradual, that it almost never makes a headline, and yet over time it may reshape the map of the human world more permanently than any storm. It has nothing to do with melting ice, at least not directly. It is a simple, unavoidable property of water itself, and it connects the record we have been discussing to the coastlines where hundreds of millions of people live. When water warms, it expands. This is one of those facts that sounds too small to matter until you scale it up. Heat a volume of water and its molecules move a little faster and spread a little farther apart, so the same amount of water takes up slightly more space. In a glass you would never notice. But the ocean is not a glass. It is an immense body of water averaging nearly 4 kilometers deep, spread across 71% of the planet. When you warm a layer that vast, even by a fraction of a degree, the expansion adds up to a rise you can measure against every shore on Earth. Scientists call it thermal expansion, and it is one of the two main reasons the seas are rising, standing right alongside the water added by melting glaciers and ice sheets. A meaningful share of the sea level rise already recorded comes not from any new water at all, but simply from the ocean we already had, swelling as it warms. Now connect that to the ocean heat content we discussed. The 23 zettajoules added in a single year, the 9 straight years of records. Every one of those joules of stored heat is in part pushing the sea slightly higher, because the water holding that heat is expanding. The deep ocean warming that the Argo floats measure is not only a thermometer reading, it is a physical swelling of the sea distributed across every coastline, happening continuously, whether or not there is a storm in the news that week. The same record heat that bleaches the reefs and fuels the hurricanes is also, silently, raising the baseline height of the water against which every future storm surge and every high tide will be measured, and that is the cruel multiplication hidden in the ocean record. A warmer sea does not spend its heat on only one thing. It feeds the storms, and it raises the water those storms push ashore, so that when a hurricane driven by record ocean heat finally makes landfall, it does so on top of a sea that the same heat has already lifted. The surge starts from a higher baseline. The two consequences compound. This is why oceanographers watch the heat content with such seriousness, because they know it is not a single threat but a source of many, quietly loading several dice at once. The heat is potential energy, and the ocean converts it into wind, into rain, into dead coral, and into a slowly rising floor beneath the tides, all from the same reservoir. What makes sea level rise so difficult for us to reckon with is exactly what makes the whole ocean story difficult. It is slow, and it is invisible on any given day, and human attention is built for the sudden and the visible. You cannot see thermal expansion out a window. You cannot feel the ocean holding more heat. The reef dies underwater where few people ever look. The record falls in a data set most people never open. and so the most consequential things the ocean is doing are precisely the ones that slip beneath our notice, because they do not announce themselves the way a storm or a heat wave does. This is the ocean's peculiar danger. It is the largest and most powerful part of the climate system, and it works mostly in silence. Which brings us back again to why the scientists chose the words they did. They are not watching for a single dramatic event. They are watching a set of slow, compounding, mostly invisible processes all move in the same direction at once. The surface temperature and the heat content and the marine heat waves and the sea level, every gauge climbing together, and every one of them sitting at or near a record as an El Niño begins to add its pulse on top. Uncharted territory is not a single number off a chart. It is the whole dashboard reading high at the same moment, at the start of the event that historically pushes all of it higher still. But the ocean does not keep these consequences to itself, out at sea. Through the invisible connections that link the Pacific to the whole atmosphere, the heat comes ashore, and it arrives as the weather in your own forecast. Part 16. When the heat comes ashore. The ocean does not stay in the ocean. That is the thing to understand about why a record in the tropical Pacific ends up mattering to a farmer in Africa, a city in South America, or a family watching a flood rise in Asia. Through a set of atmospheric connections that scientists call teleconnections, the heat stored in the sea reaches out and rearranges the weather of the entire planet, and a record warm ocean feeding a building El Niño is a machine for redistributing where it rains and where it does not. Here is the basic idea, stripped of jargon. When El Niño warms that vast stretch of the tropical Pacific, it changes where the biggest thunderstorms of the tropics like to form, because those storms follow the warmest water. And when you move the tropical storm zones, you move the great rivers of air that flow around them, the jet streams and circulation patterns that steer weather across the globe. Shift the engine, and you shift everything downstream of it. This is why El Niño has such a consistent global signature. It tends to bring heavy rain and flooding to parts of South America, drought and fire risk to parts of Australia and Southeast Asia, disruptions to the monsoon that billions of people depend on, and altered patterns across North America and Africa. The specific effects vary from event to event, but the principle holds. A warm anomaly in one ocean becomes flood and drought on distant continents. Layer onto that a second effect, one that follows directly from the heat itself. A warmer ocean surface evaporates more readily, and warmer air can hold more moisture. For every degree the lower atmosphere warms, it can carry several % more water vapour. That extra moisture is not a gentle humidity. It is ammunition. It is the raw material for heavier downpours, because when a storm does form, it has more water to wring out of the sky. This is the mechanism behind the intensifying rainfall extremes that have shown up around the world, the deluges that drop a month of rain in a day. The record warm ocean is loading the atmosphere with more water than it has ever carried at this time of year, and that water has to come down somewhere. And there is the connection to the heat that human beings actually feel, the connection we have explored on this channel before. A more humid atmosphere does not only bring rain, it makes heat more dangerous. The human body cools itself by sweating, and sweat only works when it can evaporate, which it does poorly in humid air. So when a record warm ocean pumps more moisture into the air over a heat wave, it raises the humidity. And the combination of heat and humidity is far more lethal than dry heat alone. The ocean record we open this video with is not disconnected from the brutal heat and humidity that so much of the world has endured. It is part of the same system. The sea holds the heat, vents it into an atmosphere it has made moister, and the result is weather that is both wetter where it floods and more dangerous where it bakes. So trace the full arc of what that June record actually sets in motion, because this is the central thread reaching its destination. The ocean absorbs 90% of our trapped heat and stores it, quietly, for years, setting record after record in a number almost no one watches. Then El Niño switches on, and the sea begins to vent that stored heat into the atmosphere. That vented heat pushes global temperatures toward new records in the year that follows. It reorganizes the world's weather through the teleconnections, shifting the rains that feed billions. It loads the air with moisture that falls as heavier floods and thickens into more lethal humidity. It fuels the storm seasons reaching their peak at the same time. It raises the sea against every coast. And it does all of this starting from a record set at the floor of the event, not the peak. Every one of these consequences is the same heat. The heat in that 1/10 of a degree, spending itself across the world in a dozen different currencies. This is what the people who measure the ocean can see coming, and it is why their quiet is so much more persuasive than anyone's shouting. They are not looking at a single record and calling it a catastrophe. They are looking at the first move in a sequence they have watched play out before, and they are noting that this time the sequence begins from higher ground than ever, with more heat in the system than ever as the amplifier switches on. They cannot tell you exactly how it ends, and to their credit they do not pretend to. What they can tell you is the direction, and the direction is the whole reason for the phrase that started all of this. Not a number off the chart, a path leading off the edge of the map we have, which leaves us with the question this entire video has been circling, the one that the record on June 21st plants and refuses to answer, the one the scientists are watching the coming months to resolve. If this is the floor, what is the ceiling? If the ocean is already breaking records at the start, what happens when the event that broke every record before it finally reaches full strength? That is where we have to end, not with an answer, but with the honest shape of the unknown. Part 17. What the scientists are watching now. If you want to know how seriously to take the phrase uncharted territory, the most useful thing you can do is watch what the scientists themselves are watching, because they have named the specific gauges that will tell us, over the coming months, whether June was the opening of something large or merely a hot moment that fades. There are 3 of them, and each one is a question the ocean has not yet answered. The first is the strength of the El Niño itself, and its timing. Right now, the event is young, only weeks old since the official declarations in early June, and the forecast points toward a likely strong event, but strong is a range, not a fixed number. There is a meaningful difference between an El Niño that reaches the threshold scientists label strong and one that climbs into the category they call very strong, the territory of the Godzilla event and the Great El Niño of 1997 and 98. That difference determines how much stored ocean heat gets vented into the atmosphere, and therefore how many more records fall, and the timing matters as much as the strength, because these events typically peak in the winter following their onset many months after they begin. So the true test of the June record is not June at all. It is what the ocean reads in the late months of the year and into the following winter, when this event should be nearing its maximum. The scientists are watching to see how high the staircase climbs once the engine reaches full power, and they will not know for months. The second gauge is the calendar year itself, and whether 2026 ends up in the record books. Simon van Gennep said plainly that he expects 2026 to rank among the warmest years ever recorded, and that prediction is a testable one. Each passing month brings a new Copernicus bulletin, a new set of readings from the floats and the satellites, and month by month the answer will assemble itself. If the pattern of the past holds, the vented heat from this El Niño will push the back half of the year and the start of the next even higher than June, because the atmosphere runs its step behind the ocean. Watching whether 2026 climbs into the top ranks of the record, or overtakes it entirely, is watching the delayed consequence of that June floor arrive in real time. It is the difference between a record that was a peak and a record that was a beginning, resolved in monthly installments. The third gauge is the one that will arrive with the most force, and it is the storm seasons. The Atlantic hurricane season and the Pacific typhoon season both build toward their peak in the later months of the year, which means they will reach their most dangerous stretch at roughly the same time the ocean is nearing its hottest and the El Niño its strongest. We have already discussed the tug-of-war in the Atlantic, where El Niño's shear fights against record ocean heat, shifting the danger from the number of storms toward the intensity of the ones that form. The coming months are when that tension resolves on the water, storm by storm, and where the abstract fact of a record warm ocean becomes concrete in the form of how fast a given system intensifies before it reaches land. This is the gauge that will not stay in a data set. It is the one that comes ashore. Notice what all 3 of these have in common. Not one of them was settled by the June record. The June record only set the stage, established the floor, and posed the question. The answers are all still ahead, in the second half of the year and beyond, which is exactly why the scientists speak in the language of a beginning rather than a conclusion. They are not waiting to see whether something will happen. They are waiting to see how much. And that is a fundamentally different kind of waiting. The kind you do when the direction is already clear and only the magnitude remains uncertain. For all of us watching from shore, this is what turns the ocean record from a passing news item into something worth keeping an eye on through the rest of the year. The story is not over. In a real sense, it has barely started. Each monthly bulletin, each new reading of the tropical Pacific, each storm that spins up over that record-warm water is another data point in answering the question June asked. And the honest thing to say is that we do not yet know the answer. What we know is that the ocean is at a record, the amplifier is switching on, and the people who watch it most closely have told us, in their careful way, to pay attention to what comes next. But to really grasp why any of this matters so much, it helps to step back one final time, past the storms and the reefs and the coastlines, and look at what the ocean actually is in the machinery of this planet, because we have been talking about it as if it were one system among many, and it is not. Part 18. The Memory of the Planet. To understand why 1/10 of a degree in the sea should command more attention than almost anything happening in the sky, you have to appreciate what the ocean actually is in the life of this planet, because we tend to think of it as scenery, the blue part of the map, and it is nothing of the kind. The ocean is the flywheel of the entire climate, the vast reservoir that stores and releases the heat that governs everything else, and once you see it that way, the record we have been discussing stops looking like a weather story and starts looking like a change in the planet's deepest machinery. Consider the sheer scale of what the ocean holds. It covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and it goes down, on average, nearly 4 kilometers. The amount of heat it can store dwarfs the atmosphere so completely that the comparison is almost absurd. The top few meters of the ocean alone hold as much heat as the entire atmosphere above it. The whole ocean holds vastly more. This is why the ocean, not the air, is where the real accounting of the planet's heat has to be done. The atmosphere is thin and flighty and quick to change, which is why weather is so variable day to day. The ocean is deep and slow and enormous, which is why it, and not the air, is the true record of the planet's energy. When we found that the ocean absorbed 90% of the excess heat, that was not a surprising quirk. It was the natural consequence of the ocean being the overwhelmingly larger reservoir. The heat went where the capacity was. And because the ocean is so slow to warm and so slow to release, it functions as the planet's memory. The atmosphere forgets last month. The ocean remembers decades. The heat pouring into the sea today does not vanish. It is stored, carried by currents, mixed downward, and it will shape the climate for years and even centuries, long after the year it entered the water. This is the sense in which what happens in the ocean now is not really about now at all. It is about the momentum being loaded into a system so vast that, once it is moving in a direction, it cannot be quickly turned. The 9 straight years of record heat are not 9 separate events. They are 9 years of momentum accumulating in the planet's flywheel, and a flywheel that large does not stop spinning because we wish it to. The heat that is in the ocean is committed. It will express itself on the ocean's own schedule, in storms and rising seas and shifting rains, over a span far longer than any news cycle. Step back even further, past the span of a human life, and the ocean's role becomes almost humbling. Over the great stretches of Earth's history, the ocean has been the stabilizer, the great thermal buffer that kept the planet's temperature within the narrow band that complex life requires. It has absorbed shocks and released them slowly, smoothing what would otherwise have been violent swings. That buffering is the quiet service the sea has performed for the whole span of civilization, and indeed for far longer. Every stable harvest, every predictable season that let human beings build cities and plan for the future, rested on an ocean that held the climate steady. What the record heat represents, in the longest possible view, is that buffer being loaded closer to its limits than it has been in the entire span of recorded human history. The stabilizer is still stabilizing, but it is doing so while absorbing more than it ever has, and the phrase uncharted territory is, at bottom, an admission that we do not fully know how a buffer this large behaves, as it is pushed into a range it has not occupied before. This is why the scientist's quiet unease carries so much weight, and why I have kept returning to it. They are not reacting to a hot month. They are watching the largest and slowest and most powerful component of the entire climate system move, steadily, in one direction, into a state it has not held before, at the moment the great natural amplifier switches on. 1/10 of a degree at the surface of that system is not small. It is the visible edge of a change in the planet's flywheel, its memory, its buffer, the thing that everything else depends on. And a change in a system that large and that slow is not something you can undo by noticing it late. The momentum is already in the water, so when you hold the whole picture, the record and the timing and the baseline and the heat content and the reefs and the storms and the rising seas and the reorganized rains, and you set all of it against the true scale of what the ocean is, the small numbers finally sit in their proper frame. They were never small. They were the readable surface of the largest heat engine on the planet changing state, at the start of the event that has historically pushed it furthest. That is the whole of it, and it leaves us exactly where the scientists are left, standing at the edge of what we can measure, looking at a direction that is clear and a magnitude that is not, with one question that everything in this story finally comes down to. Part 19. The weight of 1/10 of a degree. We have always believed deep down that the ocean was too big to change. It is the thing that has been there in every human story, the vast blue constant at the edge of every map, older than any civilization and larger than anything we could touch. We have treated it as the background against which everything else happens, the stable stage on which the drama of weather and history plays out. But what if the stage itself has started to move? That is the quiet vertigo underneath this entire story, and it is why a number as small as 1/10 of a degree can carry so much weight. It is not the size of the number, it is the size of the thing the number is describing. Let me gather the whole argument into one place, because you have now seen every piece of it, and the pieces only reveal their meaning when they stand together. 1/10 of a degree, taken alone, is nothing. But that 1/10 of a degree was not alone. It was the average of the entire global ocean, which means the energy behind it is almost beyond comprehension. It was set on June 21st, at the very beginning of an El Niño, which means it arrived at the floor of the event that historically pushes temperatures highest, not the peak. It was sitting on 9 consecutive years of record ocean heat content, which means the baseline it rose from was already higher than the planet has held in the span of recorded history. It held for every day of the rest of the month, which means it was a shift and not a spike, and it appeared alongside marine heat waves covering more than 80% of the global sea, records falling in the tropical Pacific and the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic at once, which means it was not a hotspot but a condition of the whole ocean. Every one of those facts multiplies the others. That is how 1/10 of a degree becomes uncharted territory. We have always believed that if something this important were truly going wrong, it would look dramatic that catastrophe announces itself with noise and spectacle. But what if the most consequential change of our era looks exactly like this instead? A modest number in a dataset, a careful sentence from a soft-spoken scientist, a reef quietly dying where no one is looking, a sea rising too slowly to see. The ocean does not do spectacle. It does momentum. And the danger of a system that changes through momentum rather than spectacle is that by the time the change becomes obvious enough to frighten everyone, the momentum is already loaded and cannot be quickly unloaded. The scientists are unsettled precisely because they can read the momentum now, in the quiet numbers, before it becomes loud. Their calm is not the absence of alarm. It is what alarm sounds like in people trained to measure rather than to shout. And this is the honest heart of the whole story. The thing I have tried to hold steady against both the people who exaggerate it and the people who deny it. The truth needs neither. It does not need the ocean to be boiling, and it does not need the record to be fake. It only needs to be seen clearly. A record ocean at the start of an El Niño, on a baseline 9 years into an unbroken climb, with the amplifier just switched on and the peak still months away. That is not a doomsday, and it is not a hoax. It is a measurement, taken from a dozen independent angles that all agree, of the largest heat reservoir on the planet moving into a range it has not occupied before. You do not need to inflate that to be worried by it, and you do not get to dismiss it by pointing at someone else's inflation. It stands on its own, exactly as measured. So what do you do with a fact like that? You watch it, honestly, without flinching in either direction. You keep your eye on the gauges the scientists named, the strength of the El Niño as it builds, the monthly readings as the year climbs, the storms as they spin up over that record water. You resist the comfort of the two easy stories, the one that says it is all engineered and fake, and the one that says it is already over and hopeless, because both of those stories exist to let you stop paying attention, and paying attention is the one thing this moment actually asks of you. The ocean is telling us something in the only language it has, which is temperature and time. The least we can do is read it accurately. Because here is what the accurate reading comes down to, stripped of every exaggeration and every denial. The sea that has quietly protected us for the whole of human history, absorbing our heat, buffering our climate, holding the planet steady, is now holding more heat than it ever has. And the natural event that unlocks that heat and pours it into our weather has just begun. We are not at the end of that process. By every historical pattern, by every gauge the scientists are watching, we are near its beginning. The record we opened with was the floor, and a floor in a stairwell you cannot see the top of is the most unsettling place of all to be standing, because it means every direction that remains is up. Part 20. When it fully arrives. So we arrive back where we started, at that single tenth of a degree on the 21st of June, except now you can see it for what it actually is. Not a small number, not a shattered record, not a boiling sea or a manufactured lie. It is a floor. It is the lowest step of a staircase the planet has just started to climb, set down at the beginning of the event that has, throughout recorded history, carried the world's temperatures to their highest peaks. Everything the ocean has done this year, the records in 3 oceans at once, the heat waves across most of the global sea, the reefs bleaching white across 84% of their range, the heat stored 9 years deep, all of it happened before the main event even arrived. That is the thought I want to leave you holding, because it is the one the scientists are holding too. The El Niño that switched on in early June is young. It has months of growing left to do before it reaches the strength the forecasts expect, and months more before it peaks in the winter ahead. The stored heat has only begun to vent. The storms have not yet reached their season's height. The warmest reading of 2026, by every pattern the past has taught us, is almost certainly still ahead of us, not behind. We measured the floor in June. We have not yet measured the ceiling. We do not know where it is. And that is the difference between the story the internet told and the story the ocean is actually telling. The internet told you a record had been broken, past tense, a thing that happened and is over. The ocean is telling you that a record was set at the starting line, present tense, an event still unfolding, with the largest heat reservoir on the planet moving into territory it has never occupied, at the exact moment the amplifier that empties that reservoir into our weather began to turn. Uncharted territory was never a description of June. It was a description of the direction. It is a map with an edge, and a sea that has just sailed past it. The people whose entire lives are spent watching this water chose their words with the care of those who know they will be quoted and held to account. The beginning of a new phase, sustained thermal stress, among the warmest ever recorded. Once more, uncharted territory. None of them said the world was ending. All of them said, in the measured language of their profession, that the ocean has crossed into a place we have not been, and that more is coming. That gap between the modest number and the enormous meaning, between the quiet voices and the vast change they are describing, is the whole of what I wanted you to see tonight. Because the ocean is the memory of the planet, and it does not forget the heat we have given it, and it does not release that heat on our schedule. It releases it on its own, slowly, relentlessly, over years we cannot rush and cannot reverse. What we are watching is not a moment. It is momentum in the largest and slowest and most powerful part of the whole system, moving in one direction, gathering as it goes. The record was the readable edge of that momentum, surfacing for a single day in a number small enough to ignore and large enough, once you understand it, to change how you see the sea entirely. So the next time you stand at the shore and look out at that vast, ancient, indifferent blue, and it looks exactly as it always has, calm and endless and unchanged, remember what the instruments have found beneath that calm surface. Remember that the ocean is warmer now than in all of human history, that it broke its record at the floor and not the peak, that the event which unlocks its heat has only just begun, and that the people who measure it are watching the coming months with a quiet they reserve for things that genuinely worry them. The surface will keep looking the same. That was always the ocean's particular danger. The most important thing it is doing is the thing you cannot see. We measured the floor in June. The El Niño is still climbing. The heat is still venting. The storms have not yet peaked. And so the question the ocean has left us with, the one it will spend the rest of this year answering whether we are watching or not, is the simplest and the heaviest one there is. If this is what the beginning looks like, what does the planet look like when it fully arrives?